So when you're writing an argumentative essay, you can structure it in a number of different ways. And many of you are familiar with the 5-paragraph model of writing that everybody is taught in grade school. Many of you are familiar with the idea that you need to articulate a thesis and defend it, but sometimes it helps to have a kind of outline or structure. And this is one possible outline, not the only one certainly, and I won't be marking people down for failing to adhere to this exact one. It seems to me that one common way of structuring an academic an argumentative essay is to begin with a question. Begin with the question that will be addressed, the issue that will be addressed by the paper. Often, this can helpfully be phrased as a yes or no question. Okay? Is David Hume's bundle theory of the self internally coherent? Yes or no? If you can articulate the question, you may not put the question in the title of your essay, you may not raise it in a question form at the beginning of the essay, but it seems to me that if you compose the essay with the question in mind that will be answered by it, you are in a clear place to begin. So I'm going to begin here not with the answer with the thesis, the position, but with the question. This is kind of, in some of you who know my past teaching work, know I'm a big believer in the philosophical priority of the question over any possible answer. So once we give the question, though, we don't proceed to answering it right away. We would first discuss the motivation, the significance of the question. That is to say, we ought to have an account in the paper, I think, in the first paragraph or two, of why it's important that we answer this question correctly. Why is it a question that is significant rather than trivial? You give the motivation for the question. You talk about the significance of the question, why it is an important question. All of this prior to actually answering the question. Part of the reason for this is to hook your reader, is to give your reader a reason to continue reading. Now, I'm paid to read your essays, I have to read them. But let us assume that you are also writing, because of the intrinsic interestingness of the topic, it's worth giving some attention to why this is an important question, why it's not a trivial question. This is the point in the essay where, especially for some longer academic essays, or for dissertations, you might find this is the place where the literature review takes place. Okay. Summarizing prior relevant views. You might even think Aristotle is doing something like this when he says, let us consider not all possible views of happiness, but the views that have a significant argument in favor of them, that have a significant number of people, respectable people, have an intellectual case for them. So he doesn't consider for very long the view that happiness is animal pleasure. He dismisses that. There are not very many cultured defenders of that. But a good many people think that pleasure is honor. I'm sorry, that happiness is honor, that happiness is wealth. So he considers that at some length. Something similar going on here, distant relation of that. Not always important, especially not for a short paper of this length, but this is the place, I think, where it fits in. You're talking about the state of play with respect to the question. Here is what people with a certain amount of authority have said. Here is where they differ. Here is where this question comes up as something that is both unanswered and in need of answering and has an important answer. Okay. The more precisely you formulate the question, I think the clearer and easier it is to actually write the paper. This also saves you from writing a paper about something that is either trivial or that has already been answered, about which there is no disagreement. So if you evaluate the state of play and you find out, wait a minute, 99% of everybody who's looked at this question agrees with my view, there's not really a paper worth writing there. You need to change the question to make it more specific, to make it controversial enough or interesting enough to actually sustain an argument. So the trouble here is an informed reader will discard your essay as trivial if you've not actually done your homework. So part of this is knowing that the work you're about to do and invest a lot of effort in doing is work that is worth doing, that is significant, that's important. Some of this depends upon audience. A paper you're writing for class, different from a paper you're writing for an academic journal, or that you're writing for a lay audience. So some of those things to keep in mind. Sometimes you may also give your reader background here that's needed in order to understand. Enough background to understand the theory. So the initial pages of the Bernecker essay, where he spends time summarizing different arguments, kind of plays into this. In order to understand the conflict, one needs to understand the current state of play. After this, after the question, after the motivation of the question, some exposition of the significance of the question, then we have the answer. This can come as early as the bottom of the first page, or even the second paragraph. It can come as late as several pages in. In fact, I remarked before when reading Bernecker, I was kind of surprised that we're 9 pages into the essay before he finally says, the purpose of this essay is to establish such and such. He's done a lot in this second category to go over the current state of play, to introduce SOSA and internalism and externalism for the sake of the argument. Okay. This is your answer, this is your thesis. If you phrased your question as a yes or no question, then you're taking one or the other side, either the yes side or the no side. From a salesman's perspective, it might be superior rhetorically to phrase the question so that your answer is yes and the answer you're arguing against is no. But it's not absolutely necessary to do that. Just some of you in sales know people find it psychologically easier to say yes to something than to say no to it. They feel a little bit more pleasure in that. So I could say rewrite your question so that your answer is the yes answer and the other answer is the no one. By far the biggest part of the paper in terms of page count is likely to be your arguments, the arguments that you're making in favor of the thesis. I would suggest there should be at least 2 or 3 different lines of argument, marshalling evidence, evaluating the evidence, making a coherent argument. This is the real sort of heavy lifting that we think of as being the main body of the paper. And it is important. This is where your paper either achieves its goal or fails. This is where you earn the A, is with your arguments. But I think it's kind of preliminary in terms of thinking and in terms of composition, helps a great deal with the argument, with the arguments. Either after or simultaneous with your presentation of your own arguments, you want to give a counter argument or objection, and you want to reply to it. You would like to defend your view against the objection. Of course, you guys know this from any basic logic or composition class. One must always fairly present the critiques of one's position. This is where, having done your homework in terms of articulating a question that has 2 sides and then reviewing perhaps the literature on both sides, puts you in a position to evaluate counterarguments and objections. Another advantage of the yes or no question format is that it invites you in your notes and in your composition to work through the arguments on both sides of the issue yourself before committing yourself to one side or the other. Since both sets of arguments ought to in some way appear in your essay, you may discover that the ones you initially thought were weak actually are quite strong to your way of thinking, Those are the ones you'll develop into this part of the paper. Some of the arguments that you formerly found persuasive. You might take the strongest of them, present it, and then indicate, perhaps by following your own process of thought, why you no longer think that it is persuasive. What objection do you see and what response do you see to it? Important not to leave that out. Okay, an argumentative essay should always include some account for the opposition. If you can't think of any plausible opposition, it may be, again, that you have the wrong question. A question is phrased in the wrong fashion. If there's nothing to say on the other side, or only ridiculous things to say on the other side, either you failed to comprehend the other side, or you've structured the two sides of the question in a way that fails to be intellectually interesting. Okay, so that's, again, hazards to avoid that might be avoided by approaching the issue in just this way. Thinking about responses here, maybe just a little bit more. It seems to me there are a couple of different ways you might respond to a counter argument, simply going through the kind of logical categories of response. You might say, sorry about that. You might say, of course, that the argument relies upon a false premise. Identify the false premise. Okay, it's simply inaccurate about the facts of the case. There's some important, relevant thing that it's overlooked, a false or missing premise. It might make an invalid inference. That is to say, I might accuse the opponent argument of concluding more than it's entitled to. I might say, well, it proves a point, but not as much of a point as the author or as the arguer might think it does. And you guys know this from logic class. Those are just two basic ways of attacking an argument. It's either got faulty evidence or it claims too much on behalf of that evidence. I might also find an equivocal or vaguely used term so that there's some linguistic or terminological or conceptual problem, that there's a shift from one definition to another definition in the middle of the argument. That's, externalism only works because of a misunderstanding about what I mean by knowledge. So this critique of my position does not hit the target because of this shift in meaning. Okay? Or I could say that the objection, the counter argument simply frames the issue in the wrong way. That entire way of framing and approaching the argument is the issue is somehow inappropriate. That's going to be the hardest one to talk about because that's going to vary depending upon where the framing is. But it seems to me these are at least four different ways that you might respond to an argument, an objection to your own position. False evidence, bad inference, shift in meaning that affects the argument, or the framing is simply mistaken. We ought not to think about this in terms of X. We should think about it in terms of Y, and then argue for the superiority of your framing. What makes a framing superior to another? There's a lot more to say about that, perhaps, but some suggestions. We're not quite sure how to respond other than to say, this isn't right. You should be able to articulate in some detail just where it goes wrong. And then lastly, as far as the conclusion goes, you want to, what should I call this? Everybody knows about writing a conclusion to an argument. So I could say conclusion, but let me call this payoff and next steps. This is part of your conclusion. And it should mirror in some ways these first two parts. Since you began talking about the significance of the question, you're now able to talk about the significance of your answer to the question. Say, now that I have proven this, this is what benefit we get. Here is what we now know because my argument has succeeded. Sometimes call this the victory lap stage. This is the place where you can spike the football. Or, if that's inappropriate, talk about the next steps. What new vistas, what new openings for argument are available, right? Where might this go? What's the sort of next thing along the path in terms of the argument? Okay, if I've moved the ball by answering this question, yes, what might be the next question that could be addressed. This could just be raised speculatively. Okay, this is where you earn the right to speculate. Now, some people will write entirely speculative papers, and I mean speculative here in a sort of colloquial sense. What if? What if this is the case? What if this is the case? Wouldn't it be interesting if these things happen? That's not an argumentative paper. It doesn't make an argument. It just engages in some elaborate wishful thinking. Where speculation might be appropriate in argumentative paper is a little bit at the end. And I say you have to earn the right to that. You have to earn the reader's respect by proving something. And then you can say, on the basis of what we proved, maybe this would be the thing that we could go to next. The reader now can nod his head and say, yeah, okay, so you've earned my respect. You've earned the right to a little bit of this. Don't overdo it. Okay, don't reach too far. But this is the place where you can sort of indulge your desire for a little bit of what if you want to do that. I would say the payoff here should reflect what you earlier said is the significance of the question. Having established that this is an important question to answer, you can now say, here is the importance of my answer. Here's why my answer that I think I've proved now satisfactorily, here's why it is an important conclusion that we have come to. Okay. So in that way, it kind of closes off, mirrors step 2 up here, down at the bottom at the conclusion. So something a little bit different from the standard high school, middle school conclusion, intro conclusion, right? In this paper, I will X, Y, Z, and then the conclusion, in this paper, I have X, Y, Z, right? That tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them approach. That works maybe in a very basic way, but I think this is a little bit more detailed and perhaps more subtle way of structuring an intellectual argument and a philosophical argument. I haven't said a lot about this because this is, like I said, this is actually where the paper succeeds or fails. If everything's good, but this is not good, the paper is going to be awful. But this is how you dress up the argument. This is how you structure, you can frame those things with maybe 2 pages at the beginning and a page at the end with your argument and counter-argument responses in the middle so that you can think through it clearly, your reader can read through it clearly, and it may be easier to compose. Questions about this?